I know it's an unusual. Can they hear me online?
I think so.
Okay, great. So thank you for coming at 11 o'clock. It's an unusual time, but it's a time we wanted to capture the audience in the Middle East as well. If you go any later, people will not tune in. Also, I couldn't do it as well. So because I teach stuff. So thank you for coming. We're very excited about Hiba being here. But first, I'm going to do a quick introduction about COPOS and tell you about some of the other programming we have for this semester. And then I will leave the floor to Hiba. So before I introduce Hiba, I would like to acknowledge that Critical Ottoman and Ottoman Studies is part of Cornell University, which is located on the traditional homelands of Gayokohono, the Cayuga Nation. The Gayokohono are members of an alliance of 6 sovereign nations with a historic and contemporary presence on this land. The Confederacy precedes the establishment of Cornell, New York State, and indeed the United States of America. We acknowledge the painful history of the Gayokohono dispossession and honor the ongoing connection of Gayokohono people, past and present, to these lands and waters. This is our first event this semester, which fits squarely into our mission at Critical Ottoman and Post-Ottoman Studies, or COPOS, which is to feature the latest in research about Southwest Asia, North Africa, and Southeastern Europe, and their connections to the wider region. The ultimate goal is to establish Cornell as the hub of innovative studies in Southwest Asia, which challenges traditional understanding of this part of the world. We have several events that are going to take place for the rest of the term. It's actually quite packed. I don't know how that happened. I thought we were going to do a few, and then suddenly we have a bunch. So I'm just going to tell you quickly when the dates are. But please look on the website at either the Critical Ottoman and Post-Ottoman Studies, or send us your email. Send it by chat if you're on Zoom, or give us your email, and we will let you know when we have talks. This way, we'll send you an email. We promise we will not send you anything other than emails about talks. So we'll not be marketing anything. So we have a talk that's coming up. So March 16th. We will be celebrating the publishing of one of our professors, Professor Seema Bezekstani's new book. It will be a book launch, and it will take place at 12 o'clock at 80 White House. March 20th, we have Nilay Ozokyunduwan, who will be talking about her newly published book, and it will take place at 4:30. And the title of the talk will be Understanding Mobility in the Ottoman Empire through the Case of the Kurdish Tribes. Where we will, all of the information, there's a lot of detailed information that we'll give you once on the website. Of course, I'm just going to try to get people to kind of save the date. So if you go on the website or you're on the email, you should get detailed information for the locations of all of them. April 12th, we will hold a webinar that will discuss the Turkish elections. Because the elections, of course, the horrors of what's taking place right now in Turkey is something that is on our minds. But this was scheduled before then. This is about Turkish elections that are scheduled for May 15th. We will have 2 experts on Turkish politics, contemporary Turkish politics, that will be joining us online from Washington, D.C. and Istanbul. April 25th. We will hold the annual talk commemorating the Armenian genocide. This time we have Ari Shikarian, and it will take place at 4:30. And finally, April 26th, it will be a noon talk, a lunchtime talk, a visiting scholar from Turkey, from Dicle University, will be discussing her research. Her name is Shul Shaheen Gilkad, and she will be talking about how the empresses, or I should say the women sultans, were discussed comparatively in English as well as Ottoman literature. So it's a very interesting and exciting topic. Today's talk, Atoms for Peace in the Middle East, Borders, Reactors, and Nuclear Lives, is co-sponsored by the American Studies Program, the Jewish Studies Program, the Iraqi Institute for Peace and Conflict Studies, and the Near Eastern Studies Department. We're very excited to have Hiba here. We'll have Hiba in this part of the world. Hiba just moved from Cairo, but she's at Bennington University. Professor Hibatullah Taha is an associate professor of Israel Studies at, I'm sorry, assistant. Did I just say something?
Associate.
Assistant professor of Israel Studies at SUNY Binghamton and an affiliated scholar at the Nuclear Knowledge Collective at Sciences Po in Paris. She is a scholar of politics and international relations whose work lies at the intersection of political economy and security in the modern Middle East, particularly Israel and Palestine. Her doctoral work analyzes the role of Palestinians, the 1948 Palestinians as subject of Israeli capitalism and colonialism. More recently, she has been researching nuclear histories, technologies, and imaginaries in the Middle East, some of which has been published in the Third World Quarterly, International Affairs, and Global Affairs. So, without further ado, please welcome Professor Taha.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you, Stella, for the invite and Meg for the help with organizing the event. So I'm delighted to be here and to share my work. So the image that you see on the slide is from a PR campaign by General Dynamics, which is a US defense company that advertised globally about this peaceful nuclear technology. This was part of a campaign that was launched in 1955, and it paired different languages with the unique struggles facing a particular community. So they were highlighting that nuclear technology could be a solution to a variety of different problems. So we can already see the idea of a utopian potential invoked in nuclear technology. Today, I will be talking about another utopian plan based on nuclear technology, the Strauss-Eisenhower project, which was a plan to build nuclear reactors in the Middle East for the purposes of water desalination and scarcity. And this was expected not only to revolutionize diplomatic relations between Israel and its neighbors, but also to transform the physical landscape, economies, and the societies of the region. But as a means of introducing the atomic age in the Middle East, I'll start by telling you an intriguing story about weapons in Israel and Palestine, which can help us grasp the extent to which nuclear technology is a blank slate for projection of the future for anxiety and there are reports in Israel about how rumors of possession and use of the atomic bomb by Jewish militias played a role in the takeover of Safed in the north of Palestine in 1948. Jewish militias developed a mortar that became known as the Reactor, which was reportedly extremely loud, but not particularly useful for battle otherwise. Because it used a bomb that was too big, it was quite inaccurate. However, it was still used in Safed and in Jerusalem, mainly to scare. And as far as the myth goes, its loud noise led many Palestinians in Safed to believe that atomic bombs were being used against them. Now, I should say the year 1948 was a time of uncertainty in Palestine. Tensions had escalated after the UN partition plan, resulting in a war between Arab states, Zionist militias, but it was also a time of global uncertainty. The unveiling of the atomic bomb as a new technology and as a weapon of war by the United States in August 1945 had resulted in discussions all over the world about how it would change people's lives, how it would affect science and technology, but also how it would influence the international system. And over the course of these 3 years, between 1945 and 1948, the atomic bomb had become quite rapidly a new reference point that also shaped the structured political possibilities. Now, there are variations of the story on the rumors about the use of atomic bombs in the war. In some reports, this was a rumor that was deliberately encouraged by Jewish militias as a strategy of war. In others, it was not the loud sound of the weapon, but an untimely rain and flooding in May 1948 that encouraged the speculation on the use of the atomic. This impression was a result of reports at this time that circulated that describes the ability of nuclear weapons to change weather patterns and to define nature more broadly. In another version of this rumor, the myth emerged following industrial and technological cooperation with the US, which had led to machinery being imported from the US. Later reports claim that the rumor originated from many scientists working on the Manhattan Project in the US and Jewish. But generally, these reports from US and Israeli sources are pleased with the outcome of the rumor, even sometimes going as far as to describe it as a miracle. These stories read like a colonial fantasy in many ways. They are part of a recurring Israeli discourse on how Palestinians simply fled during the war, a discourse that overlooks the violence that was inflicted upon Palestinians and their expulsion from their lands. The story of this weapon is memorialized in a public square in Safed, and that's what you see on the slide. And in the square, it doesn't mention the fact that the myth that the mortar was mistaken for an atomic bomb, but it does note the miracle of the weapon that scared Palestinian residents and encouraged them to speak. And as historian Nima Sadha reminds us, stories like this one can encourage us to rethink these lines between forced evacuation and expulsion, and to better understand the experiences of the Palestinian Mensa. Now, these reports tend to rehearse well-known Orientalist tropes about Palestinians and Arabs in general, as being naive and unintelligent, probably uniquely emotional, frantic, prone to this frenzied behavior. They ran like mad and left the town completely, reported a New York-based Yiddish language newspaper recounting the story in January 1989. That's what you see on the slide. In addition to being a colonial fantasy, though, this report reflects another fantasy, the fantasy of nuclear deterrence. Even rumors of nuclear weapons are enough to deter the enemy. And in fact, this fantasy will later become the cornerstone of Israeli policy on its nuclear weapons, which are officially governed by the principle of aminut, which translates into opacity or ambiguity, i.e. that Israel does not confirm or deny having nuclear weapons. As the architect of the Israeli nuclear program, Shimon Peres, declared, believing that Israel had the power to destroy them, return to the Arab states, they abandoned their ambitions to destroy us. Sticking to official Israeli policy, his autobiography carefully discusses rumors of Israeli nuclear weapons as part of its deterrence strategy, without confirming that they do exist. The final thing I want to highlight about this rumor is that it captures the widespread anxiety over, but also the fascination with nuclear technology. Around the world, from the United States to Brazil to India to Egypt to Japan, nuclear technology was being discussed through its utopian and dystopian dimensions. This fascination with nuclear technology, including projections of how it can completely alter geography, continued for several decades afterwards, and it informed projects like the Strauss-Eisenhower Plan, as we see today. Not unlike these rumors about nuclear weapons, the Strauss-Eisenhower Plan reflected an imagination of nuclear technology and what it could accomplish. So these rumors can serve as an entry point to understand the extent of the uncertainty that was happening at the time and the unknown elements that accompany nuclear power. And as we'll see today, even figures like Strauss and Eisenhower, who were supposedly very well versed on nuclear technology and knew it very well, were still using it as a blank slate to imagine the future. Now, just to give a bit more background on Israeli nuclear history, Israel began building a nuclear weapons reactor in Dimona in 1957 with assistance from France. By 1967, Israel had an operational nuclear bomb. And on the eve of the war in June 1967, Israeli officials reportedly developed a doomsday plan to detonate an atomic bomb on the mountain in the Sinai Peninsula in Egypt, close to an Egyptian military complex, with the intention of testing the weapon to send a signal and deter Egyptian forces. This never happened because, of course, as you know, Israel won the war within 6 days. In the process, it occupied the Sinai and the Gaza Strip, which were under Egyptian control, the West Bank and Jerusalem and Jordan, as well as the Golan Heights in Syria. And the bomb was never even moved to Sinai. I'm happy to talk about this later. But it's in this context, this strategic landscape of the Middle East, the aftermath of the 6-Day War in 1967, that US officials became first aware of the military purpose of the Dimona reactor, and second, became very adamant about promoting the Strauss-Eisenhower. So the Strauss-Eisenhower Plan is also sometimes called the Eisenhower-Strauss Plan, sometimes just Strauss Plan, and sometimes water. In addition to building nuclear reactors to desalinate water and produce electricity, it entailed the return of Palestinian refugees who had been displaced in 1950s. So here's what I'm doing with the rest of my time today. I'll proceed to discuss the parameters of this project, who Lewis Strauss was, why I'm interested in researching this plan, and how I'm studying. I'll talk about the details of the Strauss-Eisenhower Plan to understand how it fits, it doesn't fit with the reality of nuclear technology at that time. And I'm suggesting that it represents a US-led vision of a capitalist utopia in the Middle East. It used nuclear technology to not only reimagine relations, but to reimagine the region itself, including its geography, which is being arid, unproductive, and unfitting for human life. And even the return of Palestinian refugees, which is a key component of this plan, was imagined in a way that sought to render them, their labor, newly productive. Much of the plan, as we'll see, adopted Israeli language and discourse, but there is also a sense that within this capitalist utopia, states didn't matter. The political conditions would resolve themselves through the technology, and the state as a central component of policymaking almost seemed marginalized. And finally, in lieu of confusion, I'll leave you with some questions that I've been thinking about, which I've been happy to discuss, but also talk about it. I hope that sounds good. Now, let me first say, this was a really ambitious plan. It was crafted by two figures who were both prominent in US nuclear policy making. The first is Dwight Eisenhower, who has been president of the United States from 1953 to 1961. And the second is Lewis L. Strauss, who served as the chair of the US Atomic Energy Commission between 1953 and 1958. The Strauss-Eisenhower Plan followed the same logic as Eisenhower's flagship program, Atom Peace, which had been launched in the 1950s to spare peaceful nuclear technology, particularly nuclear energy, as part of US. And Strauss had been one of the chief architects. Strauss was the one who came up with this plan as a variation of Atom for Peace, but focusing on the Middle East, and presented it to Eisenhower in 1958. It was shelved for a long time and then reinvigorated after 1967, as I mentioned. Eisenhower and Strauss written a public proposal in June 1968 in an article in Reader's Digest called A Proposal for Our Time. The plan was presented by Eisenhower and Johnson, President of the US. The idea was debated in Congress for several years. The Oak Ridge National Laboratory in Tennessee, which is the largest laboratory in the US, which does nuclear research, carried out a study and an assessment of the plan in the 1970s. Technicians carried out trips to targeted areas in the region to collect data, while representatives from the Israeli and Egyptian nuclear apparatuses visited the US. Strauss, as an individual, was quite a controversial figure. As chairman of the Atomic Energy Commission, he supported the development of the hydrogen bomb, which is thousands of times more destructive than the atomic bomb, mainly because he believes that the Soviets would develop it, because they were communist atheists, to use this very flattering term. But Strauss's most controversial move, which has now arguably defined his legacy, is his accusation of Robert Oppenheimer, the theoretical physicist, sometimes called the father of the atomic bomb, of disloyalty. And I think this incident will be dramatized in a Christopher Nolan film coming out later this summer, where Lewis Strauss is played by Robert Downey Jr. So Strauss spearheaded a public effort to remove Oppenheimer's security clearance during McCarthyism, presiding over a series of hearings that ultimately resulted in Oppenheimer's security clearance. Strauss was Jewish and religious. He was involved in Jewish philanthropy in the United States. He was active in the American Jewish Council, which was officially a non-Zionist institution until 1957. It didn't work actively to support the creation of the Jewish state in Palestine, but the American Jewish Council came to support the partition of Palestine Strauss adopted this stance. Originally, he sought to distance himself from Zionism before 48, and then afterwards he started to revive his position. By 1967, he seemed to have fully embraced the idea of a Jewish state in the Middle East. He visited Israel and participated in a trip to Masada, which is an ancient site that now has acquired a mythological meaning in contemporary Israel. And he subsequently wrote about his experience on this. And I'm happy to report to you that his article got a lot of rejection from journalists. It's not only us. His personal views on Israel likely influenced the evolution of this plan. Strauss became increasingly invested into Israel as a Jewish state and in trying to ensure its existence in the Middle East through peace with its neighbors. Throughout his career, Strauss met and corresponded with several Israeli figures, including Israel's ambassador to the UN, Abba Eban, and even Israel's first prime minister, David Ben-Gurion. He had no analogous connections with Arab leaders. Despite Strauss's softening stance towards Israel, I should mention that there is no indication that he supported Israeli nuclear proliferation or acquisition of nuclear weapons. In fact, he reportedly told the very large Israeli delegation at the Athens International Conference in Geneva in 1955 that Israel will not even be allowed minute amounts of. Strauss is very much in favor of nuclear technology and nuclear energy, which he views as the obvious next step for humanity. He became famous for his declaration that atomic energy would be too cheap to meter. So we can already see how he bought into this idea of a nuclear utopia. He saw nuclear technology as having the potential to change everything. Like many others at the time, he embraced the idea of a technological fix to social and political problems. And nuclear technology was especially seen as a magical solution. And as you can see on the slide, he likens the atom to the surgeon's scalpel, emphasizing that the atom can be a tool of good and that we should not only understand it through our fear of the atom. The Strauss-Eisenhower Plan has received limited attention in the literature on nuclear politics, usually mentioned in passing or footnotes, rather than studied systematically. And in some ways, this is understandable because the plan was never implemented. But as we'll see, there was a great deal of effort and even resources, financial and political, that were spent on this plan. This research is interdisciplinary. It combines political economy, diplomacy, and nuclear studies. Through this work, I aim to challenge the focus on horizontal proliferation and the spread of nuclear weapons to new states, which continues to dominate discussion on nuclear politics, especially in the Middle East. The motivation for this project is to shed new light on how nuclear thought overlaps with and is shaped by affective dimensions as well, like imaginations of the future, utopian ideas, and cultural images, all of which have generally been seen as beyond the scope of nuclear studies and traditional international relations scholarship. So this research revisits the history to question and critique how nuclear studies have been narrated within the disciplines of international relations and security. The research is based on consulting written records of the plan, including official statements and other government records, different drafts of the plan, personal correspondences of the architects of this plan, and a study of the press in Arabic and Hebrew. I am in the early stages of this work, so I'm very much presenting a work in progress. I'd still like to try and find material, for example, from the field trips that were carried out to the region and from the scientists who visited the US, which can perhaps add more context on how the utopian ideas met the reality. When Strauss proposed this project in 1958, it was very early in the history of nuclear energy. Nuclear energy had been hyped up from day one, and this is not an exaggeration. Truman mentioned nuclear energy explicitly in his speech discussing the bombing of Hiroshima on August 6, 1945, which mentioned this destructive new weapon, but also mentioned energy, science, and the understanding of nature's force. Afterwards, people started imagining the potential effects of nuclear technology, how it would revolutionize human life, how it could restructure society, how it could transform international life. Utopian technologies were widely predicted at the time, including in the Middle East, where people, for example, imagined the end of colonialism because they thought colonial powers would no longer need to exploit their colonies because they would then have atomic energy. People were also imagining labor exploitation would cease to exist because of atomic energy. So they imagined a complete revolution being achieved by means of atomic energy. But these dreams and these fantasies aside, the progress to develop any form of nuclear energy was actually quite slow. The world's large-scale nuclear reactor, the first one, was in the US and was operational in 1957 only. And this was not too far from here in Pennsylvania. Now, the Strauss-Eisenhower proposal was explicitly for very large nuclear plants. It described its own proposal as bold. To be compelling to the actors in the region, Strauss believed, this had to be a massive project. That was the only way they would be willing to let go of their political disagreement and work together. When asked whether he thinks that the different actors would accept the plan, he proclaimed, "I don't see any chance of continued survival for a government that turned down fresh water or rejected cheap electricity." And according to Eisenhower, the project has to be really enormous because the bigger the plant, the more economic the operation. So this was very early in the field of nuclear energy, and they were envisioning plants that were at least 10 times larger than those that were being drawn up at the time. They had no idea whether these could be done, let alone the cost, or whether this would make economic sense. According to some of these highly optimistic reports, the nuclear plants would be able to desalinate 1 billion gallons of water per day. They will be able to provide 6,000 megawatts of usable electricity. The expectation was that the nuclear plants would be operated by an international company to avoid potential friction between Israel and the Arab states. And the idea was that state control over such a strategic project could create political tensions, but the private sector could be a neutral engine of growth. The reactors would be regulated by the International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA, which had been created through Eisenhower's atom. The reactors would have to be fully under IAEA safeguards to ensure there would be no fear of the production of nuclear weapons. Meanwhile, the funding for the project was to be raised from private capital or from a concept type of corporation, privately owned, for profit, but with government appointees. Eisenhower suggested setting up a corporation in which the US would own 51% of the stock and sell the remainder to bankers around the world. The cost of the project was thought to be around $200 million, and it was estimated that the 3 reactors could be built in 5 years. Again, these estimates were highly optimistic, including in terms of cost. So what you see on the slide are some optimistic reports that were carried out by the US Atomic Energy. What is striking about this plan is that it entails dealing with nuclear technology, which has been recognized from the very beginning as sensitive, as a transnational technology, something that is to be shared, owned, and operated collectively among states. This is already quite unique. Generally, nuclear technology is as national. It's studied through national programs with an emphasis on national security and seen as part of national history. So, of course, nuclear programs are very often the result of international technological cooperation. So, as I mentioned earlier, the Israeli nuclear program was a result of cooperation in France. In the case of the US and the Manhattan Project, there were scientists from different countries, including 17 British scientists. The reactors between Israel and Egypt were expected to be built in Arish, which is on the northern coast, west of the Gaza Strip, which is labeled on the map. And it's unclear who would have been in control of this territory formally in the event of the construction of the reactor, or how the governance of this territory would have been affected by the presence of this sensitive nuclear technology. Again, this was a plan that was being drawn up right after Israel occupied the Sinai Peninsula. While the reactors were expected to be located in the north of the Sinai Peninsula, the expectation was that the water produced would not only go to the Sinai region, but also to irrigate the Negev deserts in the south of Israel. In terms of the Israeli-Jordanian component, The expectation was that it would be an industrial complex that would be able to desalinate the waters of the Gulf of Aqaba. That's the map there. The water would be used to irrigate crops, and the electric power would be used to operate industry in that area. So here we see a report showing bipartisan support for the plan on the left, and the bottom is a quote by Alvin Weinberg, who was the director of the Oak Ridge Laboratory, who discussed the agri-industrial complexes, which are also sometimes referred as nuclexes, nuclear complexes. The plan was detailed and practical to such an extent that it included not only specifications, financial assessment of the cost of the facility, but also plans for cities and villages that were to be constructed in these areas. I should add that there were cities and villages in this area, and people were living there already, but these are not mentioned in the plan. They're almost seen as non-existent, as if these nuclear power plants would be put there and then a new life would spring out of nowhere. The final thing I want to draw your attention to on this slide is that this is a place where Egyptian and Israeli scientists met even before they had official diplomatic. So Weinberg notes that in that last sentence, where he said, "We were the only place in the world at that time where Israeli engineers and Egyptian companies worked." And this is echoed also in this Hebrew report, which was published in Ma'arib, the newspaper in 1979, which you see on the slide. So Strauss had expressed concern about the Soviet Union spreading of communism in the Middle East. After all, this is the context of the Cold War. And in this project, there is an underlying dream of creating a US-led capitalist utopia. Through this technological innovation, which was professed to solve the problem of water scarcity, the Arab states and Israel would build relations and ultimately make peace, and all of this would happen through US diplomacy and US technology. Much like contemporary US peacemaking in Israel and Palestine, the plan doesn't deal with the underlying politics, but rather aims to postpone them, choosing instead an emphasis on the economy. And Strauss acknowledged as much, stating, "This proposal, of course, does not settle the boundary disputes or other acute issues now confronting the belligerents. But their settlement would be immensely accelerated and facilitated by the pressure from all sides to get ahead of this project where delay would be counted in human lives and misery." So this vision depicts political grievances as capable of being resolved within the framework of technological and economic cooperation. Meanwhile, the proposal's language and coverage emphasize the Zionist tropes of making the desert bloom. So it says in the proposal, the sweet water produced by these huge plants would cost not more than 15 cents per 1,000 gallons. It would make the desert land of this earth bloom for human needs and promote peace in the troubled area of the world. This was echoed in other publications. In October 1972, the US military journal, Military Review, referred to the plan in the following way, as slides, the Eisenhower-Strauss plan for large desalting plants to make the desert bloom in Israel and the neighboring Arab states and thus bring peace out of the conflict. In his memorandum to Eisenhower, Strauss himself wrote, "Were the presidents of the United States to electrify the world by such a proposal, as President Eisenhower did in his peace speech to the United Nations in 1953, it would be hailed and welcomed by millions who now can see no way out of the morass in which the powers are presently floundering, with its threat of triggering more widespread war. The proposal might well be the beginning of a new life in the lands of the oldest civilization." This same language was repeated in the press, a new life, new civilization, new society, etc. This narrative of making the desert bloom is a familiar trope in Israel. It's a biblical narrative, but also very much a capitalist narrative. And until today, we see still polytheism greening the desert, like the one that you see on the slide by the Jewish National Fund blueprint negative. So the future that these US officials were imagining was intellectually linked to these ideas of the desert being desolate. It reproduced images of the Middle East and Palestine specifically as barren. And in fact, this phrase, making the desert bloom, was mentioned almost every time the proposal was discussed. It was almost automatic. For example, when Johnson discussed the plan in 1967, he writes, "We will do our share to see that the peace from nuclear energy is applied to the critical problems of desalting water and helping to make the desert green." Deserts are over and over invoked as this problem that needs fixing, that requires intervention. They are seen as unwelcome to life. So of course, many people, particularly Bedouin, have lived in deserts for a very long time. And again, another quote by Strauss, where he says, "The introduction of fresh water from all three plants into the arid and semi-arid areas would have the effect of opening to settlements many hundred square miles, which heretofore have never supported human life other than on a nomadic basis." So the condescending tone towards nomadic life also fits within this idea of capitalist utopia. It is almost as if life had to be recreated, even in places where it already existed, just because it didn't fit with ideas and visions of how life should look like. What you see on the slide now is a rendition by from the Oak Ridge National Laboratory reports of an offshore version of this slide. And I find this version to be quite fascinating. I'd like to find out more about this futuristic architecture, for example, how it was actually supposed to look like in terms of workers' lives, in terms of families, in terms of social life. And as you can see from the text that I've added to the top, and the same language of making the desert blue is seen in later publications as well on Nuplex City Building, a text that was not only dealing with the Middle East, but also highlighting the potential of nuclear energy to make the desert blue elsewhere. But let's move on to discuss how this technology would be built. And this is the second part of the proposal, the part that I find more innovative. The project involves the return of Palestinian refugees who had been displaced after the Nakba in 1950. The project accordingly highlighted that it was dealing with two key issues that the region was facing simultaneously. The two key issues being lack of water and the problem of Palestinian refugees. Strauss predicted that the project would provide employment to Palestinian refugees, and sometimes this was described as being in the hundreds of thousands, sometimes up to a million. Thanks to desalination, he argued, arid desert land would turn into fertile. One of the underlying assumptions of the plan is that the reason that Palestinian refugees are unable to return to their homes is because of the desert, because of the lack of fertile land available. As the logic goes, if only there is enough water, there will then be enough room to accommodate the return of these refugees. But at the same time, Palestinian labor was expected to be useful for this large-scale mega project, for building the project itself. Refugees were not expected to necessarily return to their homes and their villages, but rather to undertake this new task of working these deserts that have been made green. This is how Palestinian labor operates, according to Strauss. The work of building the great plants, laying the pipelines, constructing reservoirs, power lines, irrigation ditches, etc., will absorb the unskilled labor of thousands of displaced persons. When the plants are in operation, the labor force could be settled in irrigated areas under conditions far superior to any life that they have ever experienced. There's something striking to me about the interplay between technology, labor, and race. Even in these utopian designs, the manual labor is as naturally undertaken by Palestinians. Though, of course, they were not consulted in any iteration of this project. Strauss sees the labor of Palestinian refugees as highly flexible, so it can be used in the beginning to build the infrastructure for the mega project, for the nuclear reactors. Then afterwards, it can be used to work in these green spaces that will supposedly come into existence. And that flexibility is a reflection of their precarity, as he notes that still these conditions would be far superior and therefore acceptable. Meanwhile, the Strauss-Eisenhower Plan essentially transforms Palestinian dispossession into an apolitical issue. It makes it sound as though the reason Palestinian refugees are unable to return is unrelated to Israeli policy or to their depiction of a fundamental threat to Israel and the Jewish state, it becomes a technical issue that can be resolved. The final thing I want to say about the refugee element of the proposal is that it actually mimics an earlier proposal that Strauss came up with for Jewish refugees before World War II, to settle Jewish refugees in Africa, and then subsequently allow all refugees to settle in that territory. The plan was thought up by Strauss, who's on the left on the slide, by Bernard Baruch, the wealthy statesman most famous for the Baruch Plan, which called for an international monitoring of all nuclear energy, and in the middle, and Herbert Hoover, who was a former US president whom Strauss had worked for as part of relief efforts during and after World War I. So these three men had all been involved in relief efforts for Jews in Europe. And they came up with this plan aiming to save refugees who were at risk of genocide, but it also adopts many of the colonial undertones of the time, assuming, for example, that there was such a thing as an empty land. And they explicitly were inspired by the history of the United States as a safe haven for Europeans. Only one area remained in the world, Strauss recalled, which offered a topographic and climatic parallel to the undeveloped United States of 1820. That is to say, a part of Tanganyika, Kenya, northern Rhodesia, and the Belgian Congo. At first, most of the immigrants were Jews who happened to be under the greatest pressure at the time, but the three men expected that all refugees from totalitarian states would eventually be welcomed. As Baruch stated, in this new land, there would be place for tens of millions, and they would be the best, the strongest, and the most courageous people because they are anxious to get away from these over-regulated, two-stepping civilizations of Germany, Russia, and Italy. The project was expected to cost $500 million, and both Strauss and Baruch were willing to donate 10% of their own personal fortunes for the plan. But the British owned most of the territories at the time. So Strauss visited London in summer, most of these territories at the time. So Strauss visited London in the summer of 1989 to push for the resettlement plan, but the British refused to discuss the possibility of resettling any refugees in the plan. Okay, I'm about to conclude, I promise. As the Strauss-Eisenhower Plan was taken up by different actors and different administrations, it underwent some change. At some points, the World Bank became involved. At another point, another reactor is added, and so on and so forth. And it became part of this broader technological enterprise with new plexes, as you can see on the slide, described in terms of their ability to fix different parts of the world. So instead of offering a real conclusion, I'm posing some questions that I've been thinking about to you, and maybe we think through some of them together. Going back to the story that I started to talk, which now feels like a very long time ago, about rumors of atomic weapons, and considering it alongside how Strauss and Eisenhower saw nuclear technology, can we perhaps be thinking about the mythology of nuclear technology beyond this divide between energy and weapons? Can we also think of how nuclear technology, which is still unknown in terms of its effects, becomes this way to project a variety of political possibilities that are deeply disconnected from reality? Are they essentially tools of dreaming, of projecting about the world that different people want to see? And finally, how similar is this plan really to new liberal peacemaking that comes after it? I can see some similarities, also key differences. Can the intellectual origins of this project also foretell subsequent US efforts at Arab-Israeli peacemaking, which tend to be in favor of economic versus political relations? So I'll stop here. Thank you for listening to me and for coming. I'm happy to answer any other questions that you have, or to hear comments, suggestions.
Thank you. We have about 13 minutes for questions. You will.
Sure.
So I will leave that to you. Also, we have people online, so they usually tell us if somebody has a question. Online. So we'll go for the people in real life.
Thank you. Really fascinating. I'm Matthew Evangelist, representing one of the co-sponsors, the Refi Institute. It's a great topic, and it's really interesting research. I have just a few comments, some of them may be a bit pedantic, especially the first one, the pronunciation of Louis Strauss.
Right, I read his biography and I always forget.
It's
Yes.
weird and it's hard to
No.
say. There might be a story behind that, too, and really wanting to disassociate from German background during World War I, or I don't know what, but I haven't seen an explanation, but it's very weird that he pronounced it Strauss.
But it seems like some of the relatives within the same family do pronounce it as Strauss.
That's interesting. They, but
I don't know. Like,
they should, but he
but I
apparently
can't
didn't.
remember, I read the biography and the biographer describes that it's pronounced
Yeah,
Strauss.
it's a
but-
weird thing. So, I mean, you have, it seems to me an amazing puzzle here in that in the wake of this war, an idea would come up that peace could be made through a technological fix, in effect, and just, I mean, not knowing how long the legacy of the 1948 founding and the 1967 war has lasted, it just seems so naive in retrospect, but yeah, but you have the quotations and they really thought this might be possible. Yeah, this is another small point. You described the international dimension of nuclear technology as something unusual, bringing Israeli and Egyptian engineers together who couldn't meet otherwise. But I think that trend goes back to 1955 and the Geneva Conference that brought the United States together with physicists from the Soviet Union who took it so seriously, their government took it so seriously that they revealed information about Soviet technology that surprised the Americans, that they were willing to share that kind of information. So I think there was a precedent already. The other thing I wondered about is your description of making the desert bloom as a capitalist trope, representing a capitalist utopia. What role would you say the socialist tradition of Zionism played? I mean, wasn't that also shared by people of a socialist orientation? And in a way, the same when you said that they assumed that the agricultural workers would be Palestinian, but there's also the tradition of the kibbutzim and that emphasis on agricultural work. Finally, the last bit sounds like it could be a separate article in itself, the Strauss-Eisenhower Plan to resettle refugees. It's amazing, and also has current echoes, right, in Britain wanting to resettle refugees to Rwanda. Anyway, thank you very much, William.
Thank you very much for these comments, very helpful. I didn't think about the potential link between US-Soviet technological cooperation and 1955. I've read about it, but I guess in my head I thought Egyptian-Israeli animosity deeply rooted, more deeply rooted at the time than US-Soviet. But it's worth thinking about whether there are parallels there that can be drawn, and also how, because I know that the Israelis had a delegation, how they interacted with the Arab states at the Geneva conference is a very good question. I'd like to try and find out. As for the making the desert bloom, it's true. So many of the early Zionist settlers who went to Palestine had a very socialist education and were very much excited about doing the agricultural work themselves. In the Strauss-Eisenhower Plan, there's very little about drawing on that tradition from the kibbutzim or bringing in that element of working the land. My sense is that, and this is why I say it seems to me that the state itself is almost marginalized in this plan. It seems that even the Israeli state and its own kind of perhaps socialist leaning objectives do not really carry all, even though they draw on some of these Zionist tropes. Still, the objectives of the Israeli state may not necessarily be parts of this US.
I think that theme is in your discussion, and you might highlight it, the contrast between having a private corporation run this with states that are extremely antagonistic, not even recognizing each other necessarily, just come out of a war. I mean, I think that's one of the interesting.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. No, that's very helpful. And yeah, about the last plan with the resettling of the refugees, there's something really fascinating about almost a consistency that Strauss had, right? That he was troubled by these refugees and he wanted to do something radical to change the situation, whether it's the Jewish refugees before World War II or the Palestinians after the 8th. And yet both plans seem a little bit misplaced, right? Because they're not truly based on consulting with the people who live there, right? So there is a parallel that I'm trying to think of there, but I'm still not sure how much can I.
Can I just squeeze in one small thing, since you're so close, and if this issue of settling refugees and so forth is one that you end up pursuing, the papers here at Cornell of Myron Taylor would be worth having a look at, because he was representative to the conference in, I can't remember where, but in the late 30s, I believe, to help settle Jewish refugees. And there was only one, ultimately the conference was a failure. There was only one country that was willing to accept any, and that was the Dominican Republic. Not even the United States was willing. But anyway, if that's a theme you pursue, it's the Club Library is a great space for working, and the Myron Taylor papers.
Fantastic, thank you so much. I'll definitely do that. Maybe this is back.
Thank you so much. I found this really promising research and exciting. Also, I see in the end of your talk like continuities with the Abraham Accords and the idea of like peace and technology, security sector, and sharing of technology. There's a lot of continuity in that sense. But the issue of where is Palestinians on all this? Like just basic logistics. Who are they thinking about contacting, like workers? You kind of like say it's an Israeli-Egyptian kind of context. Where do you see any talk of Palestinians in that? Secondly, I was trying to think of where I saw this. I think it was on a text about certain organizations coming up in the 60s that were academic institutions that were being built. But there was, I remember something saying how there was certain resistance in America with Eisenhower and Kennedy with Palestinian resettlement. So plans that included Palestinian resettlement. So do you see that anywhere in the archives?
Thank you for these questions, needed questions. This is exactly the question, right? Where are the Palestinians? They're not consulted in the plan. And the Israeli and Egyptian and Americans are expected to speak on their behalf. And this is also what's a bit disturbing about the kind of resettlement plan, assuming that Palestinian neighborhoods will just be moved around, right? So the expectation, first of all, that these come back and do this manual labor construction, right? So first, as we said, building the ditches and the dams and proceeding with the actual physical construction. The reactors are a massive project. They're not going to appear overnight as much as they, depict them as magical. Who's going to be doing that? Palestinian refugees, right? Without being asked, without being expected to kind of take on a more active role in the design of their own futures, right? After these reactors are constructed, and then they transform the physical landscape, now these Palestinians go back to being agricultural workers, and then now they start working on the land, right? So there's almost a proletarianization, and then they go back to the peasants, and there's something bizarre about how they are not really seen as an actual group of people to be consulted, to be treated as equal stakeholders in this project, right? They're just this labor force to be manipulated, right? To be used according to the needs of the more important actors, right? The states that have power and that do have a seat at the table, right? But at the same time, they are seen as a problem, right? So much so that Strauss and Eisenhower think they really have to do something, right? That this plan needs to also address the fact that there are these refugees living in the middle. So they're mainly thought of as a problem that needs to be solved, but that can also be kind of used for strategic purposes. And my sense is that Eisenhower was very, as far as I found in the archive, Eisenhower was very on board, dealing with these refugees, seeing them still as a problem. Right now, I think everybody's kind of accepted that Palestinian refugees live in limbo, right? But at the time, it seemed to be an acute problem that these thinkers are saying something has to be done, some kind of intervention has to be done. People cannot live in refugees.
There's also just a continuity about like Abraham Accords. Is that something you're thinking about of just, because like even I'm kind of curious, it was a very good point about capitalist notions and what other ideas are floating around there. But just like basic modernization theories that have been washed away. It still seems that there's strong continuity till this day in kind of the politics.
Yeah, it does seem that the US's approach to kind of peacemaking efforts has been very much an emphasis on, let's focus on building some kind of economic relation first, and then the politics can be dealt with later, right? And I wasn't really thinking, I have to be honest, about the Abraham Accords. I was thinking more of in the Oslo, right? And how there was this idea that, well, the real issue of finding status will be dealt with, right? So the emphasis now is to kind of build relations and bring businessmen together, and then eventually the politics will just resolve. And I do get a similar sense of the neoliberal idea that peacemaking can occur within this framework of economic.
May I ask a question on this? There's other questions as well. Because this will probably be the last question if you'll allow me. Is there anybody online that needs to ask a question?
No.
Okay, so how realistic were you thinking this is? And I'm thinking in terms of this whole project seems to be oriented towards kind of making it as public as possible, kind of a marketing project. That sounds to me from your talk that it's less concerned with reality and more concerned with presenting ideas. Ideas that might or might not, but they're ideas that are well thought out in terms of marketing, rather than in terms of what would actually be. So my question is two-part. One, do you think this was ever really a project about creating a nuclear plant, or was it another one of those, pre-packaged, kind of marketing that gives, reinforces stereotypes about Palestinians and Israel and Egyptians and all of that through the guise of a nuclear thing? And also, if not, how did it not come to be? Like, what was the death? Like, how did it who kiboshed it?
Okay, really good questions. I don't know, honestly. I see why you're asking the question about was this just kind of diplomacy, right? Marketing in the sense that they were trying to advertise how great nuclear technology is and how great the United States is. Looking through Strauss's personal papers, he seemed very distraught that people are not picking it up and making it a reality, right? So I think as far as the individual level goes, it seems that he thought this was a very promising and potentially real project that could revolutionize everything, right? And my sense is that Eisenhower thought so as well. Maybe the people who were actually essentially in charge of implementing it by the late 1960s, early 1970s, Johnson, for example, were less enthusiastic, right? It wasn't their baby in the same way that it seemed that it was for Eisenhower, but they still kept it alive for a reason, right? And maybe that reason is more that marketing PR element. My sense, again, is that for Eisenhower and Strauss, this was something that they would really like to see come to fruition. Why didn't it happen? I think by the time when the Israeli-Egyptian treaty was signed, it didn't seem as urgent anymore. And then the US started realizing that nuclear reactors can be used for right? Around the world. And it started being a lot more careful about concerns with proliferation. And so separate projects to give nuclear reactors to Israel and Egypt by the US government in the 70s failed. And already by then you see this idea that, okay, maybe nuclear technology is not going to be this amazing fix because it also has weapons, right? And then I think the technology itself didn't go where they wanted it to, right? I think there was these amazing ideas about how this technology was revolutionary and this technology would be able to produce this very cheap electricity. It wasn't. When they started building the reactor, they realized that it just didn't follow their expectations or their dreams. And so I guess that was also a part of it. They couldn't build something that didn't practically exist.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. If not, but you might